Thank you, Miriam. Go ahead, Yatsiri. All right, then. So the first table, we will have Aaron Diaz, who is a researcher at the CSAN Center, Daniel Miles, who is currently studying Mexican-United States studies, and his studies are around the media, migration, and conception of American identity. Ian Scholar, who studied international Latin American studies at the Georgetown University, and he focuses on the migrant detention centers during the COVID-19 time in the US. And finally, David de la Rosa Gonzalez, who studied foreign affairs at the Faculty of Political Sciences at UNAM. And he is also currently studying international, or the Mexican-US relationship at UNAM. During the second table, we'll have the second episode of the 27th season of Southpaw as an alternative model of counter-narrative for the stigma of marijuana with Jose Alberto Briceño Sáenz, who studied literature and TV at the Fudan Shanghai University in China, and he has developed the terror movie, The Bloody Ceremony. Then we will listen to Cannabis Stories in American TV with Daniel Miles and Roberto Jones. He has a Master in Multidisciplinary Studies at New York University and another one in Mexico-US Studies at UNAM. And he has analyzed the stories that make people unique when combining political sciences and the story of art. Then, from movies to podcasts, the change in narrative of civil society organizations that are interested in the regulation of cannabis from 2015-2021 with Adrian Jimenez Sandoval, who is a student, a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Political Sciences at UNAM, and he is president of Oaxacan University organization Cannabis Libre. And Elizabeth Aritzibal Gomez, who is a journalist. He studied at Antioch University in Colombia. He has a master's degree in communications, and he is a candidate of PhD at UNAM. She specializes in the monitoring of the media, content analysis, and other things related to violence, illegal drug markets, security, and political cartoons. Finally, through orality and arts, the counter-narratives against cultivation, industrialization, distribution, and consumption of cannabis in North America with Dr. Aaron Diaz and Homero Mendoza. Mendoza, he teaches territorial planning at UAM Xochimilco, and he's participated in linoleum engraving art, and he has studies at the Quebec University in Montreal. He had a stay at the Regional Research Center of the Autonomous Yucatan University in Merida, studying cities and climate change. So that's what's coming up next. Thank you, Yatsiri.
Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I thank the organizers for the introduction. It is a great pleasure to be in this community of people who are studying cannabis, promoting cannabis. I have spent a great deal of my life doing that, so it is a great pleasure to be with like-minded people from other places. This presentation is related to a project that me and Dr. Maduro and my peers and Scholler and David Gonzalez are doing about the development of stigmatization and the destigmatization around cannabis in the American movies.
Desde los 90s hasta ahora,
as of the 1990s and until now.
Entonces, pues yo empiezo con un poco de contexto.
I will start giving some context.
Creo que pues, con la historia y con los marcos teóricos de este,
with the theoretical frameworks, the history
ambiente, creo que
of this presentation is important to say, and it's obvious also to say it, but anyway, it's important to highlight
el contexto del estigma de cannabis
the context around which
haciendo este
the
proyecto.
stigma started
Entonces, pues, en esta cuestión, como lo veo, hay dos dimensiones.
There are two
Hay la
traditions.
dimensión de la ley,
There's the tradition of the
que
law
tiene un poder específico
that
de
has a specific
crear
power of
estigmas,
creating
y la dimensión
stigma,
cultural
and
que
there's
tiene
a
el
cultural
poder
dimension that
de
has the
como
power
mostrar y
of
desarrollar
developing
ese estigma a lo largo
the
del tiempo.
stigma throughout time.
Entonces, pues creemos que es importante
We believe that
subrayar
it is
este contexto
important to
porque pues
speak about those
en la
contexts because
investigación del estigma
in the research of stigma
y en el proceso de tratar de
and in the process of
entenderlo y al
trying to
final
understand it
destruirlo a lo largo
and
del tiempo,
destroy
es
it,
importante entender
it is important to understand
desde pues la ubicación desde
where it
sale
originated
este estigma y cómo pues cómo podemos empezar de
and how is
hacer
it
la
that we
investigación
can
aquí.
start doing
Entonces, pues,
research around it.
¿cómo lo veo? Desde el
The way
punto
I see it
del inicio
from
más
the
importante
perspective
es,
of
pues pasó
its
en la
origin,
administración
it
de
started
Nixon
during the
en los
Nixon
años
administration
60,
in the 1960s
con la
in the US
formación
with
de
the
Ley Controlled Substance Act of
Controlled Substance Act of 1969.
Y pues el acto oficial del gobierno en marcar qué es
The government
uso aceptable
established what was acceptable or not acceptable regarding drugs with that act.
Pues en la definición más apta
This is where we started
del
having
estigma,
definitions that
pues creemos que pues
stigmatize.
es una marca general de qué es uso aceptable e inaceptable. Y con la afirmación de esta ley en la
with the
administración de
enactment
Nixon,
of this law
pues se
by
convirtió en
Nixon,
algo oficial.
it was made official.
Pues la foto a la izquierda de
Depiction
este
to the
hombre
left,
es quizá uno
that
de los
man,
ejemplos
he is
más
one
tempranos
of the
de la
earliest
creación de
examples
este
of the
estigma.
creation
De
of
hecho,
this
fue antes de
stigmatization.
la
As a matter of fact,
formación de
it was
esta ley
before
de
the
la
law was
administración
enacted.
Nixon. Este señor fue el
This gentleman was the
fue la
first
primera persona en los Estados
person
Unidos
in the US
que había sido mandado a la cárcel
who was sent to jail
crímenes asociados con
for
la
crimes
venta de
related
cannabis.
to the sale of cannabis.
Sí.
Daniel, it seems that your button is on because the people who are listening to the English version of the translation, they can hear the interpreter and yourself. Could you turn it off? Just turn off your translation, please, so that we can not hear the interpreter.
De hecho, déjame dar la palabra a Ian, que va a seguir con
But anyone, Ian is going to continue. Is this better?
Entonces, Ian.
So, Ian.
Okay. Perdón, no, sigue David.
No, I'm sorry. It's David's coming up. Yep. Thank you, Daniel. To give some continuity to the historical context, for this study, the analysis of American fiction movies and how they have created or helped in the deconstruction of stigma around marijuana growers and users, we should start by defining those concepts. Even though those concepts are used as if they were synonyms, there are certain differences that we would like to clarify between stereotypes and stigma. A stereotype is a conventional image or a prejudice, a popular prejudice about different groups of people. And this according to Barry McMahon. In this way, when we speak about the roles of a group, it is done to represent the totality, and thus you create a categorization stereotype, which can be good or bad, positive or negative. All of those deductions can help us see that behind stereotypes, we find different types of judgments, value judgments. Now, about stigmatization, Holman says that for the Greek, those were body signs that were used to expose something that was unusual and bad about the moral state of the entity. And therefore, you can see somebody stigmatized when they are marked, they are tainted. Therefore, that's deeper than just a mere stereotype. And negative attribute is highlighted through lots of stereotypes. Therefore, stereotypes can have a negative load or a positive one, while stigmatization is always negative. Can we go on to the next slide, please? it is important to say that there are different perspectives to approach stereotypes. One is a sociological, which only refers to social groups. This analyzes stereotypes as generalizations that are incorrect or that are harmful of a group's features, which reflects biases or prejudice against the entities. However, there are institutional stigmatizations, which are more systemic in nature. They involve institutional or state or private policies that have an influence in the creation or the reinforcement of certain beliefs. This is according to Russell. In our research, an example of that would be the financing of stereotypical propaganda in the Hollywood industry. In the narrative discourses towards marijuana consumers in the movies, you can see that there is institutional stigmatization that started from the government itself during the Cold War and the war against drugs. If we see how Hollywood movies represent marijuana consumers, we see that there are negative stereotypes to begin with, but if we relate it to a social entity, we'll see that it's always Black, low-income hippies who are transformed into stigmatized group in their eyes. As well, same thing with drug dealers, cannabis dealers. They are also created through different stereotypes and stigmatization, but it's more of a stereotype than a stigmatization there. The stigma against people who are consumers can be seen in different ways, and it's reproduced thanks to media inaccurate or misleading representations of the cannabis plant. Finally, in this review of movies about stigmatization, you'll see that even though stigmatization towards consumers has lessened, many movies still carry a negative perspective of consumers or the dealers, for that matter. Now, Ian, please.
Muchas gracias, David.
Thank you, David.
Bueno, Daniela, al siguiente, por favor.
Let's go to the next one, please.
Gracias. Bueno, en la década recientes en los Estados Unidos, la percepción nacional hacia el uso de cannabis ha ido cambiando poco a poco para favorecer a la liberalización y la deconstrucción del estigma sobre el cannabis. Hoy en día la legalización de la marihuana por uso recreativo a nivel federal es una propuesta muy popular en los Estados Unidos, según las encuestas recientes. Está apoyada por 2/3 de la población. Eso es más que 2 veces lo que era hace 20 años, como se puede ver en ese gráfico con las encuestas de Gallup. Y algunos estados, comenzando con Colorado en el 2012, a ver, hay problema con interpretación. Es que dice que está cerrado, ya está en mi... Veo las...
So I've been told that my audio is not clear. Yes, please turn off.
Sí, eso veo. Okay.
Turn it off once again just to make certain. Is it better now? Hello, testing. This is one of the stores in Colorado. Is it better now? Thank you. So, as I was telling you, next slide, please. The movies have been part of that liberalization and a change of attitudes towards cannabis. And the movies of cannabis in the 21st century present more positive uses of the weed plant. As David has said, the stigmatization that has to do with moral judgment is now changing in movie depictions. The modern movies directors have become aware of stigmatization. They even talk about it. They make reference to it in their movies. And the characters who are using or consuming for recreational purposes, they are not depicted as harmful criminals, like in Reefer Madness. or the movies in the 1980s and 1990s. We will focus on analyzing those movies that attempt to deconstruct stigma over cannabis in one way or another. However, trying to deconstruct stigmatization does not mean it will be achieved. There are many elements of stigmatization that are unconscious, that are obvious, and it is not easy to change all of those images in the people's minds when they've seen them on the screen. It is also important to say that we do not know exactly what are the intentions of the directors of those movies. However, we can see some examples in which, according to our analysis, they are trying to break away from the stereotype and to deconstruct the stigma and to show more positive images. So we will analyze Pineapple Express, White Castle, and some others that will not have harmful representations, but still it will be very difficult to get rid of all of the images that still stigmatize. That's where we'll be analyzing. We have spoken about how notice the intentions. We are going to interview, if possible, the directors of the movies or people related to their production. Right now, that's why we are negotiating to get some interviews. And with this, we conclude. Thank you very much for everyone. Thank you, everyone. And now we have time for questions if you have them.
Okay, so
okay, so you can write the questions on the chat, or you can ask them also on the YouTube. Let us not forget that by the end of the session, we will have a final round of Q&A. So, Alberto. Hello, can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you fine. All right. So, this is a very quick presentation. My name is Jose Alberto Briceño Sáenz. I was 12 years in China from 2003. I came back 1 month ago to Mexico. So I spent all that time in China. I was studying my master's, my postgraduate studies, my doctorate in communication media. And this is a very quick presentation about myself. I thank, first of all, Aaron, because he is the one who discovered me, who invited me to make this presentation. I thank this opportunity. It's been a while since I haven't presented educational academic presentations, so I feel as a newbie here. I apologize for that. So here's my presentation. The rule of this presentation is the following. Everything is true from my perspective, from my research. Unless I say what I'm saying, it's a joke or I'm going to joke, then don't take that seriously. So just pay attention to what's real when I'm joking. So I'll start sharing. Can you see it? Yes, we can. So I have to present this with the display like this, right? Yes, this is better. Thank you. Okay. All right. My presentation is called the second episode of the 23rd season of South Park as an alternative model of a counter-narrative for the destigmatization of marijuana. Okay, so in the audiovisual field, we all know, or perhaps we kind of guess, that everything that you present in the audiovisual format, a book or whatever, it has a great influence on people for the good or for the bad. So if we're speaking about marijuana, it will also have a positive or negative impact on people. It could happen that some images are neutral in certain cases, but here there are some images. I've studied this and I've seen that some people think that certain comic genre are negative because they don't really know what comedy is about. But in my perspective, I think that even if it's in a comedy show, it could be positive. This is a famous movie called The Lost Boys. You have probably seen it. It's about vampires. And this clip is just a few seconds, as you can see, and it's regarding marijuana. The characters are smoking weed. And this is what you see in the movies. In the movie, nothing more than this. So this is, I think, very much in favor because there is a movement, there's an introduction. The joint has been moved around, it's been inhaled, or the grass, or whatever you want to call it. That's the only thing you see. I analyzed of things I can remember, and I searched 40 different audiovisual products related to pot. Most of them can be of the two types: documentary or fiction, or comedies, or comedy fiction. So that's where you see these images the most. For instance, in the previous slide, it was a horror movie, a fantasy movie. And it was just a very small clip. But here there's a picture of the nations in the Pick of the Destiny, Jack Black. Probably many people have seen it. Here there are some other examples. So I like to see what's happening in the comedy world because, well, documentaries, they have a certain bias, a positive one maybe. I didn't include documentaries here because it's a research that's trying to support the positive use of marijuana. And so I didn't find that relevant for our study. That's why I focus on comedies. This is a picture of Pineapple Express. And below that you see a picture, well, a screenshot of the South Park episode. I will be talking about this specific episode that is called The Chinese Band. Mickey Mouse is smoking pot here next to one of the characters of South Park. Anyway. So we'll speak about comedies, and I have already explained why I don't include documentaries here, because documentaries, they have an intention. They're drawing to attention to something they want you to believe in. That is why documentaries are widely used by the Chinese. I lived in China for 12 years. I studied my master's degree, my PhD, my postdoctorate degrees there. And they care more about documentaries than on fiction materials because of political propaganda. So since it is so easy to tamper with a documentary to convince people whatever you want to convince them of, I don't like that. What I've seen about documentaries about marijuana, I mean, they are good, well done. They are already in favor of marijuana. So what's the point there? There's no need for us to say anything about that. But in the comedy genre, is very controversial. It is very controversial when it appears. Comedy is always controversial, not only regarding marijuana. Why? Because reality is presented in an exaggerated way. Users are usually clumsy. The people there make mistakes. They're dumb. They look stupid, if you will. And we take it for granted, right? If you watch the Looney Tunes, Mickey and Donald, everything you watch on Disney channels, the Tom and Jerry, the Slack and Stick comedies, or the Roadrunner, it's just silly stuff. It's just making fun. It's just joking, horsing around. But that's not a problem because you're not stereotyping characters. They're cartoons. They're animals. You are not saying, oh, the Mexicans, the Africans, no, or the Americans are like this or that. The French are stupid. No, it's just a roadrunner and a coyote. Perhaps the artist could make them look more of a certain nationality, and that could be problematic. But that is why before the movies we had the fables of Aesop and other things that used animals, because if you speak of animals, you can speak about people without speaking about people directly, because people are very sensitive. it is very easy to offend or to get offended. So this is something that can create a certain safety net, or if you may, an obstacle for the creator sometimes, because they need to find a way to say something without avoiding censorship or offending people. I don't think that problem should exist, honestly. I think that we should be free to say whatever we want, but that's what exists. So comedy has always received a lot of critique, a lot of backlash. Something that I found is that what people say about the genre is because of people who are consuming or are within the chain of weed, pot, or whatever you want to call it, marijuana, the plant hashish. So they resist, but what's interesting is that consumers are the ones who are making those movies. Do I make myself clear? So it is their own self-critique. They're making fun of themselves. Like here, Tenacious Day, here we have different stereotypes. This is a stereotype of a smoker, or a funny way of presenting it. And here you have a rapper to your right. I don't know if you know him. I don't mention names, but just look at the images and see what you feel, see the stereotype happening. And this is what makes people to feel uncomfortable. Hey, wait a minute. This is what's creating stigmatization because it looks bad. But as I said, in comedies, that is the purpose. In comedies, you are supposed to exaggerate. Have you heard Jaco, Balcón, Polo Polo, the Mexican stand-up artists? There are so many of them who are making fun of themselves. Eugenio Derbez, he acts like an idiot. Adal Ramones, they use themselves as their punchlines. That's the point. So regarding marijuana, well, is there a positive representation in marijuana in comedies? Well, when you say something as a joke, you make it less intense, less threatening. If you're making fun of something, if you're presenting something as something funny, you are allowed to see things that you wouldn't normally accept because it threatens you. You see it as something like a joke in a light-hearted way. It's not something that's aggressive or something that is humiliating or something that's forbidden. It's just a joke. It's not a taboo. It is something that is a comic relief. It's accessible for everyone. It's for family members, for children. So this can help to introduce subjects that are difficult for societies to discuss. For instance, here's a take of the comic comedy. I worked in China for many years with a Mexican cartoon that's called My Best Friend, and I received a lot of censorship because I was a foreigner. I was arrested in China because of that. So in China, I was arrested because I was a foreigner during a comic, and I was not even speaking about drugs. So here we have the subject of marijuana or cannabis presented from a comedic perspective. Now, this is all images from the cartoon from the South Park episode, The Band in China. This is the second episode. You see the name at the beginning of the presentation, and the first subject of the cartoon is about, or this episode is about a grower. That's the main character. Here he has his crop, and this man wants to go to China. The second subject in the episode is that there are children who have a rock band. And at the end, you see that the episode is divided into two main themes. One is the person who wants to export marijuana to sell the Chinese, because there are so many Chinese. If I sell my product, they are going to become a millionaire. And then the musicians who have a representative manager that says, if you want to sell your product, make money, you have to sell to the Chinese. Let's do something that the Chinese will like. So in the cartoon, they are, from speaking from marijuana, because marijuana is not the sole theme of the episode, which is a mistake. it would have been good if it had been the only thing they discussed, because the whole storyline of this episode or literature or whatever is I believe that if you don't focus on this, you kind of lose sight. So the important thing is not to be inside the concept of marijuana, but to include more themes, not to be the only theme, because this is another way in which you can have a broader perspective. And if you expand your scope, you can start seeing other things, values. Negative values could also be included about marijuana if you do that also. So one of the themes here was China. The two themes, the father who wants to sell marijuana and the kids who want to become famous in China, their common theme is China, not marijuana, not weed, which is very similar to the Lost Boys theme, which is not exclusively about marijuana. In this case, they're speaking about more of the censorship of China. You see a Chinese guy behind, paying attention to how they are writing their music and not letting them do it. Or the other one is the Communist Party, even in the US, is trying to censor people. So when I wrote my thesis for my master's degree in China, my teacher would correct my thesis telling me, you need to use statements such as, China is the best country, I love China, China is my love. Same thing in my PhD. My graduation was postponed 1 year because I was not including positive propaganda about China. This is real. What South Park is presenting, it's true, it does happen. This is the father when he got to China, he got arrested as soon as he set a foot on China. His briefcase was full of weed, full of cannabis. He was arrested because of that reason. Very similar to what happened to Paul McCartney when he traveled to Japan. He was arrested. Then he was freed. Because at the same time the movie happened, this is the Hollywood censorship of China. I don't know whether you know this, but in China, Winnie the Pooh was also censored. Everything Winnie the Pooh related was erased and deleted and forbidden because some Chinese said he looked like the president of China, and that it was inspired after him. So this is something that was also discussed during that episode. Weed loses its intensity because of the other elements that are introduced in this cartoon, and because censorship becomes more relevant for the storytelling here than a positive perspective of weed. It is more aggressive, right? So some comparisons on the web of the Chinese president with Winnie the Pooh. And this is Mickey Mouse, who's very angry at Winnie the Pooh because they are not allowed, Disney is not allowed in China because of his fault. And so Winnie the Pooh is killed. I've only have 5 minutes left, right? Yes, please. So everything's real. People have been arrested in China. The two Michaels. We also have Robert Lloyd Schoenberg for drug dealing. He was killed. A capital crime. Carmen Salinas has been banned. Shirley Zhao, the woman who just won an Oscar last week for some comments she did about China. Some students who have been censored by China. There is a girl that's called Shuping Yang who gave a speech that was very controversial for them. A lady from Tibet who was also censored because she became the student president. So I've been in China, and sometimes I feel that people cannot separate politics from economics. They try to, they want to. They want to separate economics from politics, but at the end of the day, it ends up that you cannot. It is like the movie Mars Attacks from Tim Burton. They always want to strike a deal with the aliens, but they end up killing them. So this is another way in which we could interpret Julian Herbert's books, The House of Foreign Pain, and that is why at some point there was a prison of Chinese. I think that could be the reason. And I believe that the president of Mexico should not ask for forgiveness from the Chinese. The second episode of South Park, let's go back to that. The animation is something that can help you speak about anything, if it's a taboo, comedic narratives can help eliminate prejudice, stereotype, and can make it light to speak about anything. So this makes it very practical. The practical use can eliminate prejudice and negative stereotypes. Marijuana has to become something that is practical. This is what is happening when documentaries speak only of the good things about marijuana. Why is comedy positive then? Because you're creating a genre. The more pieces of work around marijuana are created, the more you're promoting the idea of people seeing as something of your everyday life. So that's important to normalize it. We should not discard comedy or any genre as long as they're speaking about marijuana, like in Netflix now, or in any of the search engines. Lesbians, gays, they're supposed to be a genre. You're creating a genre. Same thing with the Santo, the wrestler. The wrestler genre was created in Mexico, but it doesn't exist in other countries. Same thing in martial arts as a genre. In Mexico, it doesn't exist, but it does exist in China. So these takes are also taken from South Park, from the same, but here they're combining videos, pictures of real people that appear on the cartoon. You see people who are smoking, and you also have people who are demonstrating in Hong Kong. You see this on the cartoon. But these pictures are more intense of people who are opposing the government than marijuana itself. This is more intense. Now, the practical use, there is a movie called Screamers from 1995. Peter Weller here. And this is a practical use that I mean. It's not marijuana, but smoking. Smoking is saving his life. That's what I mean by practical use. This is a small fragment of Resident Evil Extinction. Here you see an actor, Oded Fair, and he is smoking a joint because he's about to die. The zombies had already bitten him. He is going to crash a vehicle to kill them and to kill himself. What is the last thing I want to do? Smoke. There's another alternative movie that is called Synchronic, because I mean, it's not about marijuana, but it does mention it. Here, drugs are used to travel in time. So that's a positive use. You don't see it as something wrong. The problems of comedy, as I said, is to exaggerate moments of satisfaction and euphoria, and the use of minorities. That's why we should eliminate the use of minorities. Like, for instance, in this case, this is an African descendant, and here you have Mexicans, African descendants. That's a problem when minorities are used for comic punches. So the ideal thing would be like this. It's not marijuana. It's not a minority group. Good body. Many actors were very well behaved, they look good. Celebrities, well educated. So that's what you need. People who represent good values, maturity, intelligence, boldness, beauty. That's what you need to have in your movies, so as to try to eliminate the bad thing. All of the actors you've seen on the screen, they're all consumers. They have all said it. Paul McCartney, you can see him now. Paul McCartney says that the cannabis substances, he says it, is less harmful than whiskey, nicotine, or glue. And those others are legal. The only negative depiction, because everything is good, as I said, because you're creating a genre, that's good. The more movies you have, the more materials there are about marijuana, the more you accept it as something natural. The only thing that is negative is when you show mental, physical, social, family, or economic problems with the sale. Like other speakers have spoken about this movie, Reefer Madness. And even in the movie, they tell you, tell this to children. See how they are exaggerating the face. Or Permanent Midnight. It is not speaking about marijuana, but about drugs. But look at the representation of Ben Stiller, how he's high, how he's dizzy, and he is injecting himself in front of a baby. Well, that's negative. Then you have the fighter, Christian Bale, who is very thin for this role. And this is what could be considered as negative, to show the harm. You also have the Basketball Diaries, where you see how DiCaprio is being harmed by, and he's stealing money from his mom because of drugs. That's negative. But what are the movies out of which exist as from South Park I think are positive and good? I'm about to finish, Aaron. Just one more minute, I promise. The movies that I consider are truly good, positive, and present a good image. You have Strays with Van Diesel, Canadian Strain. These two other movies. Kid Cannabis is really good. Even though it would seem it's negative, no, it's a good one. Because there you see the economic side of things. There you have other TV shows that are not only about marijuana, like, for instance, Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad is about meth and other drugs, but you are so much involved with the main character that you think you want him to win. You have empathy for him, and that's a practical use. Once again, speaking about the practical use, he's a professor who's trying to get cancer treatment, cancer surgery. He wants to survive and take care of his family. That's important. Do you know what I'm saying? It is representing personal important values. Then you have Universal Soldier with Jean-Claude Van Damme, who hasn't seen the movie and would like to inject the heart substances to become stronger. Then you have Synchronic, we talked about that. Constantine, it's about drugs, but it's about somebody who's drinking alcohol because alcohol lets him have powers, extra sensorial powers. Then you have Hot Tub, other types of drugs, but once again, it's just minimum and it's something legalized. The important thing is that your movies shouldn't speak about how it's not legal, but just to take it as if something legal, usual, normal, everyday life use. That is what the line should be like. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you. With this, I conclude.
Thank you, Jose Alberto. Now, Daniel Miles and Roberto Jones. Good afternoon. 1 second, let's just share our screen. We're going to talk a little bit about our research. It's called Cannabis Infused Narratives of Diversity on American TV. So we are investigating 2 specific TV shows where these narratives of diversity, contemporary narratives, change the stigmas that we have seen in a lot of the other presentations from speakers. There's some overlap here with some of the previous presentations. This is about stigmas that we've seen on TV shows. It's great that we had the chance to see Jose Alberto's presentation because the theoretical background that we use has a lot to do with the elements that he mentioned. We talk mainly about world construction and maintenance. And whether it's film or movie, it matters, although in this project we are focusing on TV presentations. These presentations have the power of building or maintaining stereotypes or thoughts that we already have. And then there's also the issue of whether the person portrayed on screen is smoking with somebody else or alone. Is drug use being represented as something normal? And can we think about the person and the act as normal? These presentations continue to build our stereotype and our stigmas, and they perpetrate them. And this is about how whatever it is that we see on screen, well, is what is the people and the drugs they're using. So we're thinking about the way in which it's portrayed and the presentation. If we see something in a park, for example, and there's somebody smoking cannabis in the background, but that's all they're doing, well, we think that according to the text, it's normal. It's portrayed as normal. On the other hand, if we see something like someone doing something bad or something antisocial, then we make a correlation in our minds between this act that is portrayed as not normal, and there's a link between using that drug and other activities that are not normal. So in this project, how are we planning to address all of these topics? Well, 2 TV shows, High Maintenance and Broad City. The shows are a bit different from each other. High Maintenance started with a low budget, while Broad City started from the mainstream, right from the start. But Roberto and myself think that these series are an opportunity to see changes in the stereotypes and the stigmas in how they portray cannabis. Broad City is about 2 friends living in New York. They're both co-created the show, and they use their original names for the characters in the show. They both have Israeli ancestry, and they're medium-high class. We see them smoking marijuana and sharing different adventures and sharing what it is to be an adult in New York. In High Maintenance, we see the story of a weed dealer who's called the guy because he's the guy you always call. And that person serves to connect the different stories that are present in the show. Each of the episodes lasts only 7 minutes, and it's specifically about human relationships, how to explain them, and what the people in them are experiencing when the dealer goes to see them and sells them weed. So we're not really focused on the dealer, but rather on the stories that stem from marijuana use. And there's no stigma really, they're really portraying reality as it is. And for this analysis, well, we have a quite broad methodology. We wanted the opportunity of saying something concrete, something specific about what's happening in these 2 shows. And at the same time, we wanted to have a well-established limit so that we can stick to the message that we are trying to communicate. So the first stage of the methodology is a scene-by-scene analysis. So we see the shows and we take notes that go in line with what we established in terms of forming stereotypes. We analyze who is using the drug, what is the context, how can we conceptualize their environment and how they use drugs, and we aggregate that data and then we aggregate them into the second table, which is more qualitative. That's a qualitative analysis. And then that's where we discuss who the people are, what is their social and cultural context in which they're using cannabis, and what can we say about the roles here and the stigmas and the stereotypes. At the end, it's about interpretation. We use a format from critical theory. So we use the data that we have aggregated to analyze it. And then we figure out what we can say about the changes and the breaks in stigmas and stereotypes around cannabis use. Right now, our central argument is that these shows demonstrate a new wave of visualization of cannabis that stem from the ambiguity of postmodernism. They highlight human relationships and they touch on certain values like other speakers talked about. And this is regardless of gender, sexual orientation, race, or age. So we see an environment where marijuana use is completely normal. Anybody can use it regardless of their personal context. And we don't have any negative stereotypes in terms of marijuana use. If you're a bad person, you're a bad person regardless of whether you smoked or not. And it has nothing to do with that. So just a reminder, I don't think I explained myself very well in the last presentation, but the way we're doing it is we are working from a context where we address the legal use of cannabis and the cultural context. And we're talking about from when the Nixon administration started the war on drugs and the history of all these stigmas. And what we are trying to say is that there are options, there are opportunities, there are examples that break with this stigma. And there's a possibility of continuing in the path to other ideas. So the first thing we did is the key definitions. We started with the word diversity. And in this postmodern context, this decategorization, well, we have this context of diversity. We need to be inclusive. We need to be diverse in how we analyze things. Over the history of television, we've seen more active inclusion in the last 10 years. Characters from LGBT characters, women, characters from different ethnicities or races. And we need to do that to analyze that in order to analyze the entire context. And together with diversity, something else we address is the process of normalization. As we've mentioned in this presentation, the way we see it is we start from the idea that cannabis use was not normalized, right? Or presentations or representations in TV shows and movies where cannabis use was not normalized. That is something that we try to address and we try to analyze. How did that happen? And what is that normalization process? How is it getting normalized? In new TV shows, it's so normalized that it happens just regularly. And the importance is not placed on the use of the drug, but rather how people relate to each other. And lately, well, there's this whole process of destigmatization around cannabis use. And there's the portrayal of cannabis use from people from different backgrounds. So women, people from different ages. And what we're trying to say is that there is a process of destigmatization. And that is what we're trying to analyze. Now, why postmodernism? We talk about postmodern art, and we need to think about this art in a quasi-liquid state. It takes references from other places, and then these change to be able to do the narratives that we're seeing. And it creates a spectacle through these references. And at the end of the day, it proves that being human is not necessarily being encapsulated or stuck in different boxes. Being human is a complex thing. And like postmodernism, it's fluid, it's liquid. We are constantly changing. And these two TV shows will portray a postmodern social reality where these stigmas are no longer operating. The stigmas now develop in a completely normal context, and these activities are accepted without dwelling on them, without saying, oh no, this is kind of strange, this is not normal, this catches my attention. No, instead it is completely accepted and there's no stereotyping. So with the analysis, we arrived at the stigma around cannabis use. And some factors that are relevant, like age, gender, sexual preference, and race. Both shows, High Maintenance and Broad City, offer us different lenses, different perspectives for this analysis. What we say at the end is that there are many dimensions of cannabis portrayed. This is what we argue. And we're going to give some examples of gender in Broad City, which has feminism as a central theme. So part of our research has dealt with the fact that marijuana use is gendered. It's usually seen through a male lens. Men who criminalize marijuana or deal it and so on, and women are relegated to the background. However, in this show, women move to the foreground and they use marijuana as a way to gain empowerment. In terms of gender, in the show High Maintenance, we also see that playing a role. Gender doesn't matter in terms of cannabis use in the show. In terms of sexual preference, both shows deal with bisexuality, for example, asexuality as well, being able to experiment with different partners at the same time. So in terms of sexual preference, both shows destigmatize cannabis use, and they also destigmatize gender and sexual preference. As for age, well, in both shows, age doesn't matter. We have people from all ages, old people, young people who are just getting started to smoke. And they are portrayed in an environment of normality. And as for race, the ethnic roles are made specifically for the people who are acting these roles, the actors. So the creators are the actors in many cases, or are friends with the actors. So these roles do not take race as a central issue or theme. Race is simply another part of being a human being, another element. And if you have any questions, these are my emails. This is our contact information, and we can also answer them now later. Thank you so much to the both of you. So the questions will come at the end of the panel, but now we will have Adrián Jiménez Sandoval and Elizabeth Aristizábal Gómez. You have the floor. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. We are very thankful to be able to be in this space. We've heard very interesting things, and I think we'll be able to have a great talk. This has filled me with ideas, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you see my screen? Yes, go ahead. So we are going to present this document. It's called From Magazines to Podcast. At least this is a tentative title for now. And we talk about the change that has taken place in narratives of civil society, who are organizations who are interested in cannabis regulation from 2015 to 2021. Why from magazines to podcasts? Well, because we take a lot of images, cartoons, covers from the Cáñamo or Hemp magazine, and the Regulation for Peace podcast. I am Adrián Jiménez Sandoval, and my colleague is Elizabeth Aristizabal Gomez. Hello. We're both doing our PhD in the Faculty of Political Science at the UNAM. You're in political science and you're in journalism, right? Communication. Oh, communication. That's right. And well, let's get started. What we are going to be working with on this session is that first, I'm going to present to you a timeline. I'm going to talk about the problem, the research question, and then Elizabeth will talk about the theoretical proposal, the highlights in terms of events and narratives, and then the methodology. So I'm going to start. First of all, review of the last 6 years in the cannabis regulation process in Mexico. I don't know if everybody understands this period, but it's been a very busy period. There's been a lot of change. There's a cartoon here, a cannabis user saying, "Why won't you let me float in peace?" And there's a helicopter with the police logo and some foxes there or hounds. This cartoon was published in the number in an issue after some of the legal developments. And the Terraza Güera colleagues talked about this as well. So this cartoon came out of that, of those legal developments. And just briefly to speak about the process that we have undertaken. So in 2015, there were 2 legal processes. First, the Grace case, which is the first time a permit was granted to import cannabis derivatives for a child, Grace Elizalde. It was filed by her parents, Graciela and Raul, and she needed treatment. And then the same year, the Grace case must have been around June, and then in October, the Supreme Court recognized the rights of 4 people to consume cannabis. This is from the Mexican Society of Growers. This happened in 2015. And at the same time, there was the creation by activists of the Cáñamo magazine. And it's important because Cáñamo is a means of communication. It's a magazine that includes the discourse from many organizations, many groups, even though they have a general purpose. Leopoldo Rivela and Julio Senil. But this magazine really allows to focus and spread the discourse and the narratives from the organizations that are interested in cannabis regulation and culture. That's why it's important to talk about this magazine, because it allows us to understand this perspective from the community. Then in 2016, stemming from the resolution from the Supreme Court, then there's a call for a national debate the following year by the executive and legislative powers. This happened between January and April. And by the end of April, the president presented an initiative to regulate cannabis, which includes the allowed dose to 28 grams. There was a permission of using pharmacological derivatives in cannabis research, and President Peña Nieto participated in a UN encounter where he said to move from mere prohibition to effective prevention and effective regulation because thousands of lives depend on it. That's what he said, and he presented an initiative that was approved the next year. And it changed the general health law and the federal penal code as well. However, only the part about pharmacological derivatives for research was approved. The more important part, or at least more important for the users, adults who are users, it did not pass. The 28 grams did not pass. This law was passed in April, but it was published on June of that year, 2017. And right now we are undergoing a process of definition, but apparently it's not going to happen, but who knows? Anyway, in 2018, many things happened. On the one hand, this is not quite related, but it's important to keep it in mind. The Morena party wins the elections. They win the presidency, and there's a new political configuration in the legislative branch. And even though this does not affect the process, the judicial process, 4 more amparos are granted. And, this is part of the process. This is the point where that happens with the amparos and the jurisprudence. And this will have results or consequences in the legislative branch, because it's going to trigger a process in the legislative branch to reform the articles that have been declared unconstitutional and which prohibited personal use. So these have to be modified. And then a lot of reforms came in, a lot of law initiatives, one of them very important, which is a law presented by Sanchez Cordero. She's now the Secretariat of the Interior. She was a senator at the time. And it was drafted together with a lot of organizations adjacent to cannabis movement and regulation for peace. A lot of users were involved, a lot of movements. And, many of them are also involved in the production of the magazine. By 2019, in February, these jurisprudential theses are published, and then the term for 90 days for modifying the law starts. There's a thing called the open parliament where the civil society can express its opinions. A lot of them talk about the dictamination of the initiative by Sanchez Cordero. But when there's a dictamination that gathers all the different initiatives that have been presented, and after the entire discussion, well, there's a first dictamination that is not very convincing to the collectives. This ruling, they don't appreciate it because of many reasons that were talked about by Terraza Güera earlier. So there's a first extension, and that is going to be for 2020, which was last year. Then in March of that year, 2020, there were modifications. These modifications are not very well received either, but they are approved in the commissions. And after they are approved in the commissions, they were supposed to go into the chambers for a vote. However, the pandemic hit, and the plenary session is suspended, and a new extension is granted before full approval in the Senate. So there's a new extension, and then a lot of things move online here, and a lot of the organizations that were participating in this, that were involved, also move online. And there's also the podcast, Regulation for Peace, and many other podcasts also appear in the scene right now. This one is made by the organizations that were having an impact, and they have a much more direct discourse about the process that was being undertaken. And it gives us a broader look about how the process is perceived, the regulation process. And then in November, finally, this is approved after one more extension. But the deputies, they say, we need more time. This whole process culminates in March, where it finally passes the Chamber of Deputies. And now we're in a moment of definition. In theory, Friday is the last day they have for regulation and not break the extension that was given by the Supreme Court of Justice to the legislative branch. But, well, it hasn't finished, and apparently this is going to take until September, or rather the discussion will continue in September. There's going to be another extension. It appears to be a never-ending process. And, well, anyway, this is so that we can identify where we're standing right now and when the podcast appeared, when the magazine first appeared, and, you know, also have an idea of the key events that have been happening. So this is the process, and this is a problem. In 2015, with the appearance of certain print media like Cannabis magazine and the actions of some collectives and movements that promote cannabis use, well, now they have found a way to express their opinions. They have found a place. Then also the podcast appeared. It grew as a means of communication and expression. And then it also grew with the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. And one of these podcasts is Regulation for Peace. These propose alternative narratives as an alternative to prohibition and problems that they address problems from the community, from the users, from activists. Like here, it says that, why do I have to go to school if when I finish flowering, you're just going to dry me and smoke me, right? So, and the dad says, just shut up and eat your cereal. So it's a completely different discourse. This cartoon is also very interesting. It deals with green gold. It's about two friends who talk, and they say, the problem with this harvest is that it becomes very valuable. And then the organized crime shows up, and this raises the costs and security, and then we run out of water and everything. And I don't know if it's profitable. And his friend says, I think you're right. This is dangerous. It's not as profitable. Cannabis. And the other friend says, cannabis? No, I'm talking about avocados. Avocados are what you're using up all the water, right? So this is a way to trigger people to think about other problems that are part of the same idea. So this has allowed us to reinterpret the facts and the political decisions and build alternative narratives to the dominant ones. And these narratives have diversified, and there's been more depth in these processes and these narratives. We keep having new discussions, new discourses appear. Briefly, how are the civil society organizations interested in cannabis policies reinterpreting the events where the decisions were made for the process of change between these years in the Cannabis magazine and the Regulation for Peace podcast? And what are these narratives that these organizations interested in cannabis policy have built about the events where essential decisions have been made in the process that we've talked about? So the discourses from these organizations and what they have built in the magazine and the podcasts are understood as part of the narratives that are pushed by the Mexican society for liberation of cannabis. This diversifies the social constructs about the plant. And this has to do with destigmatization and breaking the dominant narratives. So you go, Elizabeth. Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So our work talks about the institutional discourse, and we talk about public policy and the use of the discourse and the liberation. We want to think about the weight of these structures, and we also use the tool of critical theory. How does the discourse work? How do the counter-narratives work? And there's a capacity for agency in the people who are promoting these discourses and emerging narratives. So in this presentation, we don't explicitly talk about counter-narratives, but instead about alternative narratives. Because counter-narrative implies a kind of dispute, a dispute. And following this, from left to right, we're going to have narratives in this case, and political discourses that have certain elements. Some are causal histories, and an image might tell us something, might convey something, an illustration or a podcast can talk about something. There can be a character, a plot. This is one of the first things, because that's the way we can understand this faster.
Another element that is important because is the construction of problems from a journalistic perspective. And for this, we will examine 4 prototypic elements, which are who's going to be responsible for a fact, a change of policy, what moral assessment is done about that, and what are the causes or possible solutions, which sometimes a podcast image or audio can help, because this is a social construction of reality. And in this sense, what's important about narratives and how we see things is that it's presented in a discourse quality. And in this case, it has to do with people, agents, social groups that are united around a narrative or a meaning of reality. So here, the concept of promoting coalitions, civil society organizations, comes second. Of course, we include them, but we don't think that a civil organization has to be center stage. There's a mix, and in this type of mix, we create different discourses. In this particular case, we're going to have a chance of the civil societies around Cáñamo and Regulación por la Paz as well. Next slide, please. From a methodological perspective, we believe that in Cáñamo magazine, we pay attention about the covers. We see that during the first 5 editions of Cáñamo, it was a magazine where you saw the images that you have in 2015, the plant, or elements that were very much related to nature. But with the passing of time, the magazine started to assume a cultural connotation. So in 2020, you see that there are other types of images. Many times we really relate with psychedelic, with multiple colors, but here we see with this couple of images how we have gone from a natural depiction to a resignification of what you feel through the plant or around the plant. So as my colleague has said, this is a posture that is not the only one that the media is following, but many other people are also finding other ways in which to present information during the pandemic. Next image. So what we will keep on studying is the qualitative content of the images. There are 4 steps. First, you select data according to the research question. We filter, then we organize the information. We make categories of the final sample, and then we do the analysis and interpretation of the data. And this is where we'll get the alternative narratives. So here's what you see on the screen is different covers of the magazine. You see that on the first line, there's a lot of pictures of the plant, but then there was a switch. There was a change with the introduction of other magazines. When they started also in Latin America, there was a change in how it was depicted. I cannot hear you. Adrian? Turn on your microphone. Sorry, I couldn't find where to turn it on. Cáñamo magazine is an important one because it is not only published in Mexico, but it also appears in other Latin American countries, if not Spain. So in the first season of the Cáñamo magazine, the content was very nationalistic. Actually, there's even a small place in the Cáñamo issue where you see in the title, there's a leaf there. Those are the first 17 or 18 issues. And after that, there was also a change in the image of the magazine, probably so as to reach new audiences and include other elements, because the magazine started also presenting articles from other countries. So the construction became more varied, regional in nature, so that the approach was different. What he is saying is very important, because even though it's only been 5 or 6 years with 2021, great changes have happened. You can see it visually. So in a short time, we have seen that there has been a change, and it also has to do with the change of economic interest around the plant. It's not usual to see such rapid changes in the media. So this international movement around the subject is also influencing this. Next one. This image presents two important elements. We have seen, even in the last day's presentations, that instead of presenting the leaf of marijuana, now there's a different depiction of what's happening inside of you when you use it. So this is presented here, the sensory aspect, especially considering water, since we consider that we are made up by 80% of water. This is a representation of that. It's still a bit artificial, if you may, but at least when you take off the mask, you see that there's a whole universe inside, and so we could analyze what's inside the image further. But this is very interesting because the magazine contains cartoons, comic strips, but also a great deal of illustrations that can help us not have this perspective, the counter narrative to destigmatize, but there's also a diversification in the way in which we understand things. And it speaks about the different types of consumers or readers. Elizabeth, sorry, Adrian, you have to wrap up because you are running out of time. Well, some contributions that we can find in the work. First, it's to make the narratives of the community visible, because those are forms of communication that are not very much studied, at least not from the perspective of cannabis studies, but they are reinterpreting events in an alternative way, and one that is also appealing. So it's interesting. The podcast, obviously, the same. The illustrations, the cartoons of Cáñamo magazine are art that can help speak of problems for the cannabis community that is different from the banning discourse. And podcasts can also be understood as a new space of communication for the community, even though there are sound products that have existed always, like community radios. This new modality is left there. The platform, Spotify, can help new audiences get to learn, get to know about the matter, if they cannot have access to a magazine such as Cáñamo, which is very segmented. Even if we're trying to make it more inclusive, it's still a very segmented means. Elizabeth. Next slide, please. This is another fragment from the comic strip. In this change of policy, we see how it's interesting because a great part of the other groups have been working on growers and the farmers and all, and how later this logic can include discourses such as capitalistic discourses or other ideological ones. So this is something that could happen with the legalization. It's kind of a warning. So basically, this is what we've been working on, and we hope that we'll have more concrete elements when the book is published so you get a better idea. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth and Adrian. All right, now we're going to pass the floor to Aaron and Homero. Thank you. Homero, please go ahead. Hello, good afternoon. I'm sharing my screen. Can you see it now? Just let me know when you can see it. We can see it now. All right. So good afternoon once again. It's a pleasure to be here on this colloquium. And practically with me, we started with my presentation on Tuesday, and now I'm also the one who's going to turn off the lights when we leave. In this closing, I would like to introduce this proposal of a project along with Araón Díaz, which is that of resistance through orality and arts, counter-narratives around consumption and growth of cannabis in North America. I am going to expand my screen so you can read it better. Just very briefly, the presentation plan is organized around 3 ideas mainly. First, an introduction, some theoretical and conceptual elements. And even though this is just a first review of literature. And finally, Dr. Araón, he will present the methodology. We would like to speak about the stencil art and engraving as two forms of art that can help us change the discourse, the negative criminalization discourse that exists around cannabis. In this article, our intention is to develop two objectives. On the one hand, to recuperate, to rescue the narratives from the methodological side that can be described as extraordinary events that can help trigger certain resistance processes, or to fight against stigma on the side of consumers and growers of cannabis in Mexico, the US, and Canada. Through this process, our intention is also to record representation processes for these narratives by means of the creation of engravings and urban art by using stencil art with young artists, plastic artists. It is important to mention that there is a relationship that is very relevant between art, memory, and the exercise of resistance. Art has as one of its main rules to be an alternative and efficient way for expressing certain discourses that oppose, that go against the hegemony or a system that can be repressive, that can be violent. So art can play this role of denouncing, confronting, resisting against, and at the same time, it is a political tool, a playful tool for the collectives and groups and social movements. Through some examples that will be presented in images in Latin America and Mexico, engraving and stencil art have been used for different purposes, and the subjects have been very varied, especially if we consider that there's always a sense of urgency from a political, social perspective to stand up, to stand against certain state repression activities, or as of lately, against the corporations and how they are harming the land and the communities and the minorities. Here's an example of a type of art that is wooden engraving or xylography in wooden materials in Brazil. This has been used by combining two arts, literature and engraving, in something that is called the Cortel literature. And through these two types of arts, it can reflect the daily lives, the customs, or certain events of the political and social realities, the economic realities of Brazil, or the alternative realities that could be experienced by the Afro-Brazilian communities. So the starting point, the reference point, is this art that is expressing a narrative that is very marginal, very much against the official narrative, one that has been established through art, far away from the academic art or the sponsored by others. In Mexico, engraving is something that started from pre-Hispanic times, but in the case of the modern world, engraving is something that is recovered by Spaniards, and this is where the first Academy of Arts was founded in Mexico, the San Carlos Academy, the one that has trained architects, engineers, and other painters, sculptors, and other artists, as well as engravers. Some analysts say that engraving within the San Carlos Academy, others think that the San Carlos Academy was founded during the last period of the colony with a perspective that was a bit more liberal. So engraving within those plastic arts such as painting and sculpting is considered to be a minor thing, so a minor art. So young people who were studying at San Carlos found that vision limiting, and the fact that engraving was not considered to be a full art, not even within the academy, is something that they resisted. So what we'll see is that the great deployment of engraving in Mexico started more in the practice than in the world of the academia. And this is something that happened more during the 19th century, where a great part of those engravers or engraving artists were developed more for practical purposes in popular workshops where they did this work to illustrate newspapers of the time that would express events of daily life, but also through cartoons. They would make fun of politicians or certain social customs, especially during the period of Porfirio Diaz. They were also attempting to denounce the problems that they suffered because of a lack of political freedoms. Here we can see the work of Jose Guadalupe Posadas, who's very well known, especially because of the iconic image of La Catrina, the skulls for Dia de Muertos, and that are also used during the Mexican Revolution or the conflict that existed before the Mexican Revolution. This art will continue during the 1920s, 30s by Leopoldo Mendes and Paulo Higgins in the Gráfica Popular workshop. They are the ones who gave continuity to this representation of political and social matters in engraving arts. We should also say that this continuity of engraving in Mexican art is something that will influence other types of expressions like muralism. In Diego Rivera, we see a representation of the Katrina ladies' comb. You see it on the picture. And also in photography, like in the case of the movies during the golden era of Mexican movies, Gabriel Figueroa's photography was influenced by these shadows and lights, the chiaroscuro of Mexican engraving, or also the photography of Gustavo Casasola. Now, speaking about modern urban art and stencil art, as Siqueiro said, this is an urban intervention art that is very practical. It's quick, and it can help that in a very easy way you can do an intervention of a space without being caught by the police, for instance. Unlike graffiti, which is more dangerous, stencil has a certain degree of risk, but stencil is also used within graffiti. But stencil, in its political aspect, is something that has accompanied many social movements in Mexico. And I also want to bring some examples of this, of how stencil art has been used to do street interventions to resist, especially facing the mega projects that are taking place in Mexico, and they're affecting communities, the transnationals who are entering and tampering with the land. Like in this case, the Zapata image as opposing pipelines. Another movement that is also very interesting has been that of the collectives of street artists, urban artists, like in the case of Oaxaca. I believe that here there are many collectives that are accompanying the movement of the popular assembly of the Oaxacan peoples, who are fighting so that the Guelaguetza, the festivities, the festival, doesn't become another commodity that is profitable for the touristic industry or for the state, and that it loses its purpose of serving the community. So we see how stencil has accompanied those struggles. It has supported the teachers, for instance, in their uprising against authoritarian movements, especially between 2006 and 2007 in Oaxaca. So this interest that we have, Dr. Aaron and myself, is to study how those two types of arts that have a very political agenda, such as engraving and stencil, how they can contribute in breaking the stigma, destigmatized cannabis, consumption, production, and trading. So with this, I pass the floor to Dr. Arau so that he can explain a bit more about the methodology. Thank you. Some last images. All right, thank you, Homero. This is an adventure of research we're doing together. This research is a bit intense. What is it that we want to do? Well, we have a seed. Our seed of cannabis is going to be the narratives, and the flowers are going to be the stencils and the engravings. Sorry, Homero, I think you're still sharing screen. So we have those two elements. So this chapter is going to be recording the whole process. Now, this research can only be a collaborative participated in research. There's no other way for us to do this research. As of now, we are open to receive your proposals, and the participation is open to all of the people who are hearing us. So our seeds are the narratives. And why the narratives? Because through the stories, we can build knowledge to explore different realities, and at a certain point, we can also liberate or imprison us, according to Cécile taken from pain. So we're going to take the literature of postmodern literature because we understand narratives that are part of the beliefs and understandings of life and how we build our understanding of the world in which they happen. Narratives are constantly with us. They are part of how schemes for meaning-making take place. Our narratives are not secondary about certain data, but rather primary narratives. They are the primary source that establishes what will be considered as data. The new narratives are producing new vocabulary, new syntaxes, new meaning in our stereographic narrations. This is what is the building block for them, for the storytelling. So we will be using our methodological framework.
I thought right now, I'd like to ask you, fascinated by this idea of the sacred and the rituals and the divination. So I would like to know if marijuana today can have this relationship with the sacred manifestations about everything that's going on in the streets. I think that's a manifestation of the sacred in a way. Engaging, but this is a problem for the state, not so much for the capital, because the capital has its own interest and will always find a way to make a profit. But in terms of the state, the state and its whole apparatus, its essence is to control and continue with our routine daily lives. Just, drugged by medicine and by television, because I think it's better to call it a personal use or perhaps an adult use. Everybody uses it for something different. Sometimes you have a bad day and you can take the edge off by taking a hit. Sometimes you want to focus, right? I use it to clean the house, for example. And finding this mystical side to the plant, I mean, it depends. It's up to you. I think sometimes you can find it. Sometimes you can have a mystical moment. Maybe you're listening to a very nice song in a special moment while you're cleaning your house, and because you're cleaning your own environment to be in balance with yourself. So it's not necessary to make an association with something divine to talk about a sacred element to your consumption. So I think this depends on each person's habits. So I don't know, those are my 2 cents. Yeah, to build on that. I think Ismael's question can be answered in 2 ways. One thing is what the narrative and the discourse will allow us to see, in the magazine and the podcast. And we can talk about how the sacred influences the research or not. But the other thing is that we're using it as an element for social construction. And everybody uses it in their own personal way. The experience consuming cannabis or any other product, the sensibility or sensitivity, and division of the sacred, I mean, I apologize to the anthropologists because I'm not an anthropologist, and I'd like to get your viewpoint because you have more experience about what sacred might mean or not. But you can have your own rituals, and it can be sacred for you. Perhaps it's not sacred in the broad sense or sacred as was meant 50 or 60 years ago or many centuries ago, but in your own individual potential, personal life, this can be something very powerful. Thank you. Yeah, I think about it in terms of creation. Scott, for example, showed us his books and what his organization has been doing, his collective. And I think that is a manifestation of the sacred.
I'd like to jump in here if it's okay with everybody. I think earlier Adrian answered this question really well about the sacred issue. I think we could agree that this plant always, as part of its genetic makeup and its DNA, has this sacred aspect that's a part of it. But I think the fear we see happening with the commercialization and normalization is that there's going to be, this special feature of this plant being pushed to the background as people try to profit from it. So at the individual level and social level, we can all practice in a spiritual way using the plant in our diverse manners. But at the same time, as it becomes a globally profit-making crop for big companies, I think we're going to see some of the sacred stuff diluted. And that's something we should be concerned about and figure out what our role is. And I'd like to switch gears and ask a question. When we look at the world and how it's shifting with cannabis becoming a commercialized commodity in a process of creating culture and destigmatization, what do people who just presented feel about, or I know it's difficult to predict, but what do they feel about as this plant becomes commercialized across the globe, how imagery might change? What kind of changes might we see? And might we see a co-optation of cannabis imagery from its like original roots into something more commercial and of course dynamic in its own way, but certainly separated more from its original intentions?
Anybody can smoke, anybody can take a brownie because we are seeing this capitalization of marijuana. However, in terms of the narratives and the artistry of it, it would depend on how the creators or the authors or artists are trying to convey.
But also think about it. I mean, Willie Nelson was one of the most famous early weed users or smokers of cannabis. And now he's got his own sort of like, big brand, commercial strain, marketing, PR, sort of empire business. Same with Whoopi Goldberg. Last I heard of it, there's talk of Jerry Garcia, sort of becoming the brand of a new new strain of weed. So absolutely. I mean, some images of the sort of last generation of cannabis use have been commercialized. And I mean, I think that's also kind of natural just with the way that everything sort of becomes financialized once it becomes more mainstream.
Homero, adelante.
Thank you.
Homero, ¿quieres comentar algo al respecto?
Homero, do you want to say anything? Homero?
Perdón, no había escuchado. Sí,
sorry, I didn't hear. Perhaps I could give an example to respond to Mari's question. For example, in Chicano art, there are a lot of symbols like the Zapata symbol or the Virgin Mary. So with this movement that goes beyond borders, it goes beyond certain neighborhoods. So in a way, weed might become more banal, but it can recover and take on new meanings. I've always believed that it doesn't matter if it has a different meaning in the Chicano world, the figure of Zapata, as long as it fulfills a function, a role. In the case of Zapata as a symbol, well, it's the idea of defending certain principles of humanity and justice, even though it loses some of its meaning and it gains on new meanings. And in this process of commercialization and of the products or the plants or certain methods of consumption, it can take on different paths. But the interesting thing is that there are always spaces that reclaim the meanings. For example, on Tuesday, they talked about using the pulque drink together with marijuana. Pulque, for a long time, had a stigma. It was thought to be just a popular drink, and the elite, they would drink European wines instead. And then ironically, later, by the end of the 20th century, the pulque recovered a new meaning for the Mexican youth. So I think this goes both ways. I mean, I don't want to be so pessimistic in terms of the commercialization and thinking that that is just going to break everything. That's my point of view. Yeah, Homero's example that he just mentioned about the pulque is a great example because it's true that a market is opening up in Mexico. And a lot of people, we are trying to participate in this. We've heard about a lot of interesting projects. However, I think that the regulation is paving the way for a large industry. A large industry that already exists in other countries today, like Canada and US in some states. But paradoxically, Adrian is cutting off. Historically in Mexico, we've had a lot of communities that grow and use marijuana. And this entire market of users and small producers, I don't think we are finding a space in the new market that is being set forth by the regulation. I think that is the contradiction that exists. In this case, I do think some of these projects are creating a counter-narrative. In Mexico City and other states, other parts of the country, like Tijuana or Puebla, we are seeing an alternative that is based on self-growth networks or cannabis clubs, things like that. There's this market opening up that is devoted to high-income neighborhoods in Mexico City, and they're going to have cannabis with no problem. There's going to be no criminalization, but say the people in other parts of the city, like the east of the city, are not benefiting from this regulation. Instead, they are organizing among themselves. They have networks of home growers, and they're very powerful, and they have a rebellious discourse, and they talk about the global south, for example. So this is something that is being left out But there is this alternative market that exists in the margins of the new regulation. Thank you, Adrian. Anybody else? Any other questions or anything? Otherwise, we can start to wrap this up. So I'm going to give some closing words, and then Marty can say something. And then if we have time, the speakers can remain here to talk about how to follow up. So obviously, I want to thank the CISAN, Dr. Graciela Martinez, for opening this space for us, the UNAM University. Obviously, I would like to thank the coordinating team, Miriam, and everybody who made the broadcast possible, Esmeralda and Samuel. Of course, I would also like to thank the interpreters. We appreciate the work of Diego and Flor and Heriberto, who is coordinating that. So all of you that I just mentioned, thank you for making this event possible. I'd like to thank the public as well, the audience and the speakers. Your work and your research truly contributes to the fight. And this fight must keep growing. And now Marty has the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if I have much to add because you were so eloquent with your remarks just now. So I want to just thank everybody again. I've learned a lot, and I'm really excited about the work that you're doing, and I'm looking forward to see the chapters develop into some substantial contributions to knowledge and pushing cannabis research and arts-based research in new directions, including creative work that allows us to understand this culture differently and to promote and normalize cannabis in a way that creates positive stereotypes so that this recreational and medicinal product can be available for more people across the globe. So I've made some new friends during this process, and I hope to keep in touch with many of you. And thank you for the time and attention to the presentations, and of course the work of the translators. For me, especially, and other English speakers, we couldn't have been here the way we have without the interpreters and translators. So with gratitude, I just want to make sure I express that. So thanks again, and I'm looking forward to keep in touch with people.
Gracias. Miriam, si quieres, podemos...
Thank you. And Miriam, we can stop the recording right now on YouTube, and we can stay here, hang out for a few minutes. On previous days,